Have you ever been invisible? Not literally, of course, but invisible in the way that matters, where your words dissolve before they reach anyone's ears, where your brilliance is mistaken for background noise, where you show up every day, give everything you have, and still somehow you don't exist to the people who hold the power. It's a particular kind of pain, isn't it? The kind that doesn't leave bruises you can show anyone, the kind that accumulates slowly, quietly, until one day you realize you've learned to make yourself smaller just to survive. This is a story about that kind of invisibility. But it's also about something else. Something more complicated, more human, more painful. It's about what happens when the person who made you invisible falls in love with who you really are. When power meets consequence, when guilt collides with desire, when someone finally sees you, but only after they've already done the damage. He was a CEO, young, successful, brilliant in all the ways that get celebrated on magazine covers and business podcasts. He had built an empire from vision and determination, and he believed, truly believed, that he understood what it took to lead. She was just another employee, competent, quiet, the kind of person who gets overlooked not because she lacks talent, but because the world has taught her that speaking up costs more than it's worth. They existed in the same building, breathed the same recycled air, attended the same meetings, but they lived in completely different realities. Until the day he decided to disguise himself, to walk among his employees as one of them, to see his company from the ground up. He thought he was being noble, strategic, insightful. He thought he would uncover inefficiencies, identify problems, become a better leader. He had no idea he was about to uncover himself, that he would see, for the first time, the culture he had created, the harm he had caused, the people he had rendered invisible through policies and practices, and a leadership style that valued confidence over competence, volume over substance, power over truth. And then he met her, Maya, the woman whose ideas were stolen in meetings, whose voice was cut off mid-sentence, whose brilliance was so consistent it had become invisible, like wallpaper no one notices anymore. He watched her be diminished, dismissed, disrespected, and in watching, he began to see himself, not as he wanted to be, but as he actually was. The architect of her suffering, the person ultimately responsible for every small cruelty, every missed opportunity, every moment she had to swallow her own worth just to make it through the day. But here's where the story gets complicated, because somewhere between the guilt and the revelation, between the shame and the awakening, he fell in love with her. Deeply, completely, impossibly. He fell in love with her quiet strength, her graceful intelligence, her refusal to become bitter, even when the world gave her every reason. And that love, beautiful as it was, changed nothing. Because how do you love someone you've helped destroy? How do you ask for forgiveness when you're the system they've been fighting against? How do you bridge a gap created by power, deception, and years of accumulated harm? Before we go further, I need you to do something. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications. Because stories like this, stories that hold up mirrors and ask uncomfortable questions, stories that remind us that love without respect is just another form of violence, these stories matter, and your support helps us keep telling them. This isn't just a romance, it's not a simple tale of redemption where a good apology fixes everything. This is about what happens when someone finally sees the consequences of their choices, when privilege meets reality, when power is forced to feel what powerlessness feels like. It's about whether change is possible, whether love can exist across chasms of hurt, whether sorry is ever enough when the damage runs deep. So stay with me, because what's coming isn't what you expect. The biggest shock won't be the romance, it won't be the revelation. It will be the choice she makes at the end. The choice that will make you question everything you thought you knew about love, forgiveness, and what we owe to the people we've harmed. This is a story about seeing and being seen, about invisible people and the systems that make them that way, about falling in love with someone you never bothered to notice until it was too late. Let's begin. There are leaders who believe they understand everything simply because they sit at the top. They read reports, analyze numbers, attend meetings where everyone nods in agreement, and somewhere along the way they forget something essential. The heartbeat of a company isn't found in boardrooms. It lives in the quiet corners, in the exhausted sighs at the end of long shifts, in the words left unsaid because no one feels safe enough to speak them. Ethan Cole was one of those leaders. Young, brilliant, decisive. He had built his empire with precision, turning a struggling tech company into something that glittered on magazine covers. But success has a way of building walls, and Ethan had built his so high that he could no longer see the ground. He knew the metrics, the quarterly projections, the investor expectations. What he didn't know was the people who made those numbers possible. And that ignorance, warm and comfortable as it was, would cost him everything. The idea came to him late one night, wrapped in the kind of confidence that only power provides. He would go undercover, not as some grand social experiment, but as a strategic move, a way to identify inefficiencies, root out complacency, see where the system was failing. He told himself it was about understanding, about being a better leader. But beneath that polished intention lived something else. The quiet arrogance of someone who believes they already know what they'll find. He pictured himself as a hero in his own story, the CEO who cared enough to walk among his people. He didn't consider, not even for a moment, that he might be the problem they whispered about when the office lights dimmed. He didn't imagine that sometimes the most dangerous blindness isn't failing to see others. It's failing to see yourself clearly. So he crafted his disguise carefully. Plain clothes, a fake resume, a new name on the employee roster. He stepped into his own company as a stranger, convinced he was about to uncover truths. What he didn't realize was that truth, when it finally arrives, rarely comes gently. For the first few days, everything felt like a game. He observed, he took notes. He watched how people moved through the hallways with their heads down, how conversations stopped when certain managers walked by. He saw exhaustion written on faces, heard frustration buried beneath polite responses, and somewhere in his chest, a small discomfort began to grow, like a seed of something he couldn't yet name. But discomfort is easy to dismiss when you've spent years believing you're right. So he pushed it down, labeled it as data, as observation, as proof that his instincts were correct. The system needed fixing, people needed managing, efficiency required sacrifice. These were the mantras he had built his life on, bright and shining and utterly hollow. He didn't know yet that mantras become prisons when they stop you from feeling. He didn't know that the greatest transformations don't begin with strategy, they begin with collision. And collision was coming, warm and devastating, in the form of a woman he hadn't yet learned to see. Her name was Maya Rivers, though no one in the office ever said it with the kind of weight it deserved. She was the type of person who moved through spaces quietly, not because she lacked presence, but because the world had taught her that quietness was safer. She had been with the company for 3 years, working in product development, the kind of role where brilliance often goes unnoticed because it doesn't come with a corner office or a title that impresses at dinner parties. Maya was good at what she did, exceptional even. But she had learned long ago that competence without visibility is just another form of invisibility. She wore simple clothes, kept her head down during meetings, spoke only when directly addressed. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she had tried speaking before and her words had been swallowed by louder voices, by men who interrupted without apology, by a system that rewarded confidence over insight. So she adapted. She became small, and in becoming small, she survived. Ethan met her on his 4th day undercover in a conference room that smelled of stale coffee and broken air conditioning. The meeting was about a product launch, something he knew intimately from the reports he'd read in his real office. But sitting there as just another employee, he saw it differently. He watched as the team lead, a man named Derek with too much cologne and too little self-awareness, dismissed idea after idea without consideration. Maya sat near the back, her notebook open, her pen moving in careful strokes. She hadn't spoken once. When Derek finally asked if anyone had thoughts, there was a pause, thick and uncomfortable, the kind of silence that begs to be filled. Maya raised her hand, just slightly, a gesture so tentative it almost didn't exist. Derek's eyes flicked toward her with the enthusiasm of someone checking a clock during a boring lecture. She spoke softly, but her words carried a clarity that cut through the room's fog. She suggested a shift in user interface design, something intuitive, something that considered accessibility in a way the current plan ignored. It was brilliant. Ethan felt it immediately, that spark of recognition when you hear something true. But before he could process it fully, Derek laughed. Ethan watched her fingers tighten around her pen, a tiny gesture of pain absorbed in silence. And in that moment, something ugly stirred inside him, something he would later recognize as recognition. He had done this. Not in this room, not to her specifically, but in 1,000 other moments, in 1,000 other ways. He had been Derek. He had been the person who dismissed without listening, who equated quietness with weakness, who mistook humility for lack of vision. Not a warm laugh, not the kind that invites you into a joke. It was dismissive, sharp, a sound designed to close doors. "That's nice, Maya," Derek said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But we're focused on marketability, not feel-good features." A few people chuckled, the uncomfortable kind of laughter that happens when someone else is being diminished, and you're grateful it's not you. Maya's face didn't change. She nodded once, closed her notebook, and looked down. But sitting there, stripped of his title and his power, he felt the sting of it differently. He felt it as she must have felt it, as a door closing, as a light dimming, as another small death of hope. And for the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt something close to shame. It was faint, easy to ignore, wrapped in justifications about efficiency and tough decisions. But it was there, warm and uncomfortable, a seed planted in soil he didn't yet know was fertile. The meeting ended. People scattered. Maya gathered her things slowly, her movements deliberate, practiced. Ethan wanted to say something, though he didn't know what, but she was already gone, disappearing into the fluorescent-lit hallway like smoke, like someone who had learned that leaving quickly hurts less than staying too long. The days that followed revealed a pattern so familiar it had become invisible to everyone except those who lived inside it. Maya showed up every morning at 8 sharp, her bag slung over one shoulder, her expression neutral in the way that people learn when showing emotion becomes a liability. She worked through lunch most days, her desk cluttered with prototypes and sketches, ideas that bloomed in the quiet hours when no one was watching. Ethan found himself noticing her more than he intended to, not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't. In a world where everyone fought to be seen, Maya had mastered the art of disappearing, and yet her work spoke volumes. Her designs were thoughtful, intuitive, elegant in their simplicity. They solved problems before most people even recognized the problems existed. But in meetings, her voice was cut off mid-sentence. Her emails were skimmed or ignored. Her name was left off project credits. It wasn't malicious, not exactly. It was worse than that. It was casual, automatic. The kind of cruelty that happens when a system teaches people that some voices matter less than others. Ethan watched it happen again and again, and each time something inside him twisted tighter. During a brainstorming session, Maya suggested integrating a feature that would make the platform more accessible for users with visual impairments. The room went quiet for a beat, then someone else, a man named Jason with a degree from an Ivy League school, and confidence that bordered on arrogance, repeated her idea almost word for word. The team lead nodded enthusiastically, praised Jason for his innovative thinking, added it to the whiteboard with Jason's name beside it. Maya said nothing. She didn't correct him, didn't fight for recognition. She just sat back in her chair, her hands folded in her lap, her face a careful mask of nothing. Ethan felt anger rise in his chest, hot and bright, but he swallowed it down. He was under cover. He couldn't intervene. Except that wasn't entirely true. He could have spoken up. He could have said, "Actually, Maya said that first." But he didn't. And in his silence, he became complicit. He told himself it was strategic, that he was gathering information, observing dynamics. But the truth, raw and uncomfortable, was simpler. He was afraid of drawing attention, afraid of breaking his cover, afraid of being seen as the kind of person who defended the invisible ones. It was easier to watch, easier to take notes, easier to justify his silence as necessary. But necessity, he was learning, is often just cowardice dressed in cleaner clothes. There was a particular moment that stayed with him, vivid and sharp even days later. The team was reviewing a prototype that Maya had spent weeks developing. It was good. Undeniably good. The kind of work that elevated the entire project. But during the presentation, Derek barely acknowledged her contributions. He focused instead on superficial elements, questioned decisions without understanding the reasoning behind them, treated her explanations like inconveniences. At one point, he interrupted her mid-sentence to check his phone, the glow of the screen reflected in his disinterested eyes. Maya stopped talking. She waited. When he finally looked up, he waved his hand dismissively, said, "Go on," as if he were granting her permission to exist in her own presentation. Ethan felt something crack inside him, a fissure in the armor he'd built around his understanding of how things worked. He wanted to believe this was an isolated incident, a bad day, a single bad actor. But he knew better. He had seen this play out across departments, across companies, across entire industries. It wasn't an anomaly. It was the design. And he had been one of its architects. The realization didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, in moments of recognition that accumulated like sediment, layer by layer, until the weight of it became undeniable. Maya wasn't struggling because she lacked talent. She was struggling because the system was built to overlook people like her, people who were competent but not loud, brilliant but not aggressive, valuable but not visible. And somewhere along the way, Ethan had contributed to that system. He had rewarded the Jasons and the Dereks, promoted people who spoke confidently even when they had nothing meaningful to say. He had built a culture where presence mattered more than substance, where the loudest voice won even when it was wrong. And now, standing on the other side of that reality, feeling the sting of being unheard, he finally understood what he had done. It happened on a Tuesday, during a crisis that no one saw coming. The company's flagship product had encountered a critical bug, something that threatened to derail the entire launch. Panic spread through the office like wildfire, urgent messages flooding inboxes, managers barking orders, everyone scrambling to identify the source of the problem. The engineering team worked through the night, fueled by cold pizza and mounting anxiety, but the solution remained elusive. Lines of code blurred together, theories collapsed under scrutiny, and with each passing hour the deadline drew closer like a storm on the horizon. Ethan watched the chaos unfold from his position as a supposedly junior employee, his hands tied by the disguise he'd chosen. He wanted to step in, to use his authority to bring order, but he couldn't, not without exposing himself. So he did what everyone else did. He stayed late, stared at screens until his eyes burned, and felt the weight of helplessness settle over him like fog. Maya had been quiet through most of the crisis, working at her desk while others shouted across the room. She didn't join the frantic conversations, didn't offer unsolicited theories, didn't try to insert herself into the spotlight. Ethan had almost forgotten she was there until around 2 in the morning, she stood up and walked calmly to the whiteboard where the engineering lead had mapped out the system architecture. She studied it for a long moment, her head tilted slightly, her eyes moving with the kind of focused intensity that comes from genuine understanding rather than performance. Then she picked up a marker and began to write. Her handwriting was small and precise, each letter formed with care. She traced a pathway through the code that no one else had considered, identified a conflict between 2 modules that had been implemented by different teams at different times. It was elegant in its simplicity, the kind of solution that makes you wonder why no one saw it sooner. She finished writing, capped the marker, and turned to face the room. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the engineering lead, a woman named Sarah with 20 years of experience and no patience for incompetence, stepped forward. She read Maya's notes, her eyes widening with each line. She ran a quick test on her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The room held its breath. Then Sarah looked up and something close to awe crossed her face. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the exhausted silence. "This is exactly it." The room erupted in relief, in gratitude, in the kind of chaotic celebration that comes when disaster is narrowly avoided. People clapped Maya on the shoulder, thanked her, asked her how she'd figured it out. She answered their questions with quiet patience, explaining her reasoning without arrogance, without the need to prove anything beyond what she'd already proven. Ethan watched her from across the room, and for the first time since he'd started this experiment, he felt something shift inside him. Not just recognition, but something deeper, warmer, more dangerous. Admiration. Maya wasn't just competent. She was extraordinary. She had a way of seeing problems from angles others missed, of finding clarity in chaos, of making the complex feel simple. And she did it all without fanfare, without demanding credit, without needing the world to validate what she already knew about herself. In a company full of people shouting to be heard, Maya spoke in whispers that somehow carried more truth than all the noise combined. Ethan found himself wanting to know more. How had she developed such insight? What else was hidden behind that carefully maintained quietness? What would happen if someone actually gave her the space, the resources, the respect she deserved? But alongside the admiration, something else stirred. Guilt. Because he had been part of the problem. He had sat in meetings where her voice was dismissed, watched her ideas get stolen, witnessed her being treated as less than she was, and he had done nothing. Worse than nothing. He had been complicit through his silence, and now seeing her clearly for the first time, he couldn't unsee what he'd been blind to before. She wasn't invisible because she chose to be. She was invisible because people like him, people with power and position, had decided she wasn't worth noticing. The realization sat heavy in his chest, a weight that no amount of justification could lift. Over the following days, Ethan found himself drawn to Maya in ways he didn't fully understand. He started paying attention to the small things, how she organized her workspace with meticulous care, how she listened when others spoke with a focus that made them feel heard, how she smiled at the security guard every morning and asked about his daughter. She moved through the world with a kindness that seemed almost radical in its consistency. She didn't perform empathy. She lived it. And in a place where so many people wore masks, where ambition often required cruelty, her authenticity was startling. Beautiful even. Ethan caught himself watching her more than he should, inventing reasons to work near her desk, hoping for moments of conversation that rarely came. And each time their eyes met, even briefly, he felt something warm and unsettling bloom inside him. It wasn't just attraction, though that was there too. It was something more complicated, more tangled. A mix of respect and regret, fascination and shame. He was beginning to care for someone he had helped diminish, and he had no idea how to make that right. Ethan had always prided himself on clarity. In business, in strategy, in decision-making, he knew how to cut through complexity and find the direct path forward. But sitting at his makeshift desk in the open office, surrounded by the hum of keyboards and muffled conversations, he felt anything but clear. Maya had become a presence he couldn't ignore, a gravitational pull he hadn't anticipated. It started small, almost imperceptibly. He noticed when she arrived each morning, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought, the soft laugh she reserved for moments when she thought no one was listening. He found himself hoping she'd be in meetings he attended, disappointed when she wasn't. And when she spoke, which was rare, he hung on every word with an attention that surprised him. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had come here to observe systems, to identify inefficiencies, to gather data that would make him a better leader. Instead, he was becoming someone he didn't recognize, someone whose heart beat faster when a quiet woman with sad eyes walked into a room. The worst part wasn't the attraction itself. Attraction was simple, chemical, easy to dismiss. The worst part was the why. Because underneath the pull he felt toward Maya lived something far more uncomfortable, the growing realization that he had hurt her, not directly, not with his own hands, but through the culture he had built, the values he had championed, the kind of leadership he had modeled from the top. He had created an environment where people like Derek thrived and people like Maya disappeared. He had rewarded aggression over thoughtfulness, volume over substance, confidence over competence. And now, having seen the consequences of those choices up close, having felt what it was like to be on the receiving end of a system designed to overlook, he couldn't unknow what he knew. The guilt ate at him slowly, a quiet erosion that left him hollow. At night, lying in his expensive apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows and sterile modern furniture, he replayed moments from the office. The meeting where Derek had laughed at Maya's suggestion, the presentation where she'd been interrupted and ignored, the countless small cruelties he had witnessed and done nothing to stop. Each memory landed like a stone in his chest, heavy and cold. He told himself he hadn't known, that he'd been operating with incomplete information, that his intentions had always been good. But intentions, he was learning, meant nothing when the impact caused harm. There were moments when he almost broke cover, almost revealed himself just to fix things, to use his power to elevate Maya the way she deserved. But something stopped him every time. Fear, maybe, or pride, or the uncomfortable awareness that revealing himself now would only make things worse. How could he face her, knowing what he'd done? How could he explain that he was the architect of her suffering, the person ultimately responsible for every dismissal, every stolen idea, every moment she'd been made to feel small? The answer was simple. He couldn't. So he stayed hidden, trapped in a prison of his own making, loving someone from a distance while drowning in the shame of what he'd helped create. He tried to make small amends, gestures that felt pathetic, even as he made them. He started speaking up in meetings when others were interrupted, though never loudly enough to draw real attention. He made sure to acknowledge good ideas regardless of who said them. He treated the support staff with more respect, learned their names, asked about their lives. But these were drops in an ocean, barely enough to disturb the surface. The culture he'd built over years couldn't be undone by a few kind words from someone pretending to be powerless. Real change required real action, the kind that would expose him, the kind that would force him to confront not just Maya, but himself. One afternoon, Maya stayed late working on a design that had been giving her trouble. Most people had gone home, the office settling into that particular quiet that comes when the performance of productivity finally ends. Ethan had invented a reason to stay too, though he knew it was wrong, knew he was crossing lines he shouldn't cross. He watched her from across the room, the blue light from her monitor painting her face in shades of silver and shadow. She looked tired, beautiful in her exhaustion, and something in his chest cracked open. He stood up before he could stop himself, walked over to her desk with his heart pounding in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. She looked up when he approached, surprise flickering across her features. They had barely spoken beyond polite greetings, and here he was, standing too close with no good reason to be. He asked if she wanted coffee, the question clumsy and obvious, and for a moment she just studied him with those dark, knowing eyes. Then she smiled, small and careful, and said yes. They sat in the break room with terrible instant coffee and plastic stirrers, and for the first time since he'd started this charade, Ethan had a real conversation. Not as a CEO gathering intelligence, but as a person trying to connect with another person. Maya talked about her work, about the ideas she had that never seemed to find the right ears, about how sometimes she felt like she was shouting into a void. She didn't say it with bitterness, just a quiet resignation that broke something inside him. He wanted to tell her she was brilliant, that she deserved better, that the void wasn't her fault. But the words stuck in his throat, tangled with guilt and desire and fear. So instead he listened, really listened, the way she had listened to others all this time. And in that listening, in that moment of genuine connection, Ethan Cole fell completely, irreversibly in love with a woman whose pain he had helped create. The exposure came on a grey Thursday morning, the kind of day where the sky presses down heavy and low, like the world itself is holding its breath. Ethan had been undercover for nearly 6 weeks, long enough that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to walk through the office with authority, to have people stand straighter when he entered a room. He had settled into his disguise so completely that when the CEO of a partner company showed up for an unexpected visit, Ethan's first instinct was to stay out of sight, to avoid the risk of recognition. But fate, or perhaps karma, has a way of collapsing carefully constructed illusions at the worst possible moments. The visiting CEO spotted him across the lobby, his face lighting up with recognition and delight. He called out Ethan's name, his real name, loud enough that heads turned throughout the open office space. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into something viscous and terrible. Ethan felt every eye land on him, felt the weight of attention he'd been avoiding for weeks, suddenly crushing down like a wave. The visiting CEO approached with an outstretched hand and a broad smile, completely oblivious to the devastation he was about to cause. He clapped Ethan on the shoulder, asked what he was doing down here with the regular staff, made a joke about CEOs needing to check on their investments personally. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, each one creating ripples that spread outward, touching everyone, changing everything. Ethan saw the moment of realization move through the crowd. Confusion first, then shock, then something harder to name. Betrayal, maybe, or disgust. People stepped back instinctively, creating space around him as if he'd suddenly become dangerous. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Someone dropped a coffee cup, the sound of ceramic shattering against tile impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. And through it all, Ethan could only think of one person. His eyes found Maya across the room. She was standing by her desk, a folder clutched in her hands, her face completely blank. Not angry, not hurt, just empty, like someone had reached inside her and scooped out everything that made her real. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Ethan saw himself reflected in her gaze, not as he wanted to be seen, not as the man who had fallen in love with her quiet brilliance, but as he truly was. The person who had built the system that diminished her, who had sat in meetings and watched her be dismissed, who had befriended her under false pretenses, while knowing all along that he held all the power. The visiting CEO was still talking, his voice a distant buzz that Ethan couldn't process. Someone from HR appeared, stammering apologies, trying to manage the situation with panicked professionalism. But none of it mattered. All that mattered was Maya, and the way she was looking at him like he was a stranger, worse than a stranger, like he was exactly what he was, her enemy dressed in borrowed clothes. She set the folder down carefully, precisely, the way she did everything. Then she turned and walked toward the elevators with measured steps, her back straight, her head high. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She simply left. And somehow that was worse than any confrontation could have been. Ethan moved without thinking, pushed past people whose names he'd learned, whose stories he'd heard, who now looked at him with barely concealed contempt. He reached the elevator just as the doors began to close, thrust his hand between them, forced them open. Maya stood inside, her face turned away from him, her arms wrapped around herself like armor. He stepped in. The doors closed behind him. The elevator began its descent, and for several floors neither of them spoke. "Maya," he finally said, his voice rough, unfamiliar even to himself. "Please, let me explain." She turned to look at him then, and the expression on her face made him wish she hadn't. It wasn't anger, though anger would have been easier. It was disappointment. The kind of deep, bone-tired disappointment that comes from having your worst suspicions about the world confirmed. "Explain what?" she asked quietly. "That you've been lying to me for 6 weeks, that every conversation we had was just research for you. That while I was struggling to be seen, to be heard, to matter at all, you were the person who made sure people like me don't." Her words were surgical, precise, each one finding its mark with devastating accuracy. Ethan felt them land, felt them cut, and he had no defense because everything she said was true. He had deceived her. He had befriended her under false pretenses. He had let her confide in him about her struggles, while knowing he was the architect of those struggles. There was no version of this story where he was the good guy. "I didn't know," he said, and even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. "I didn't understand what it was like until I—" "Until you what?" Maya interrupted, her voice rising for the first time. "Until you experienced a tiny fraction of what people go through every day in the company you built. Until you got to play dress-up and pretend to be powerless for a few weeks, while knowing the whole time you could take the costume off whenever you wanted." The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened onto the marble lobby with its vaulted ceilings and expensive art. Maya stepped out, and Ethan followed, his desperation mounting with each step. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it more than he'd ever meant anything. "Maya, please, I know I hurt you, I know I can't take it back, but I'm trying to make it right. I'm trying to—" She stopped walking and turned to face him fully. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You're trying to make yourself feel better," she said. "You're trying to ease your guilt so you can go back to your corner office and tell yourself you learned something. But learning isn't enough, Ethan. And sorry isn't enough, because tomorrow I still have to come back to that office. I still have to work in the culture you created. I still have to watch people like Derek get promoted while people like me get overlooked. Your apology doesn't change any of that." She was right. Of course she was right. Ethan stood there in the lobby, surrounded by the trappings of success he'd built, and felt smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. "What can I do?" he asked, and he hated how helpless he sounded, how pathetic. Maya looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, just slightly. Not forgiveness, but perhaps recognition of his humanity, flawed and broken as it was. "You can let me go," she said simply. "You can stop trying to make this about your redemption and let me have my dignity. That's what you can do." Then she walked away, out through the glass doors and into the grey morning, and Ethan stood frozen, watching her disappear into the crowd of strangers, understanding with terrible clarity that some things, once broken, can't be fixed with good intentions. The weeks that followed felt like living underwater. Ethan returned to his corner office with its panoramic views and imported furniture, but the space felt foreign now, like stepping into a costume he no longer knew how to wear. His assistant welcomed him back with carefully neutral professionalism, asked if he needed anything, if there were meetings to schedule, decisions to make. He nodded through it all, signed documents, attended calls, played the role of CEO with mechanical precision, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in the moment Maya had walked away, in the look on her face that told him he'd lost something he'd never really had the right to want in the first place. He tried to focus on work, on the very things that had once consumed him with such clarity, but numbers blurred on screens. Strategy documents read like foreign languages. Every decision felt hollow, every success meaningless, because he kept seeing her face, kept hearing her voice asking him to let her go. And he realized with a shame that burned constantly in his chest that even now he was making it about himself. His guilt, his pain, his desperate need for absolution. Maya had asked for one thing, to be left alone, to have her dignity, and he couldn't even give her that without it costing him something. He saw her occasionally from a distance. She still came to work, still moved through the office with that quiet determination, but something had changed. She was more careful now, more guarded, like she'd learned that even the smallest openings could be used against her. She avoided the break room when he was there, took different routes through the building, participated in meetings via video call even when she was in the office. She was protecting herself from him, and he couldn't blame her. Ethan tried other ways to make amends, ways that felt equally insufficient but were all he had left. He started implementing changes from the top, policy shifts designed to create more equity, more accountability. He brought in consultants to audit the company culture, mandated training on inclusive leadership, created anonymous channels for feedback and complaints. He promoted people who had been overlooked, including several women and people of color who had been performing far above their titles. He even demoted Derek, citing concerns about his management style and lack of collaborative skills. The changes were real, substantive, the kind that would reshape the company over time. But they felt mechanical, like checking boxes on a list of atonement rather than genuine transformation. Because transformation, real transformation, required something he wasn't sure he could give: the willingness to truly surrender control, to acknowledge that his vision, his leadership, his way of seeing the world had caused harm. One evening, nearly a month after the revelation, Ethan found himself standing outside the building long after everyone else had gone home. The sky was deepening into twilight, streetlights beginning to flicker on, and he felt the weight of loneliness settle over him like a familiar coat. He had built an empire, but he had no one to share it with. He had everything he thought he wanted, and it all felt meaningless. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Maya standing there, her bag slung over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, "You're making changes." It wasn't a question, but he nodded anyway. Trying to, he said. I know it doesn't fix what I did. I know it doesn't make up for... It doesn't, she interrupted gently. But it's something. They stood in the cooling air, two people separated by hurt and power and choices that couldn't be unmade. Ethan wanted to reach for her, to close the distance, to say all the things that had been building inside him since that first conversation over terrible coffee. But he didn't. Because this wasn't about what he wanted anymore. I'm leaving, Maya said finally. I got an offer from another company. Better position, better pay, better culture, I think. I hope. The words hit him like a physical blow, but he forced himself to nod, to keep his face neutral. That's good, he said, and meant it despite the ache spreading through his chest. You deserve that. You deserve everything. She studied him for a long moment, and he saw something in her eyes that looked almost like sadness. I think in some other version of this, she said quietly, in some world where you had met me as yourself, where there had been honesty from the beginning, where the power between us wasn't so broken, maybe we could have been something. The possibility of it hung between them, beautiful and impossible, a glimpse of a future that would never exist. Ethan felt tears prick his eyes, but he didn't look away. I think so too, he said, and I'm sorry, not just for lying, not just for the system I built, but for all of it, for not seeing you sooner, for not being better when it mattered. Maya smiled then, small and sad but real. You're seeing now, she said. That counts for something. Not enough to fix us, but enough to maybe fix things for other people. If you keep trying. If you don't let guilt become another excuse to stop caring when it gets hard. She started to walk away, then paused and turned back. Ethan, she said, and hearing his name from her lips felt like both a gift and a goodbye. I hope you become the leader you wanted to be when you started that experiment. Not the one who already knew all the answers, but the one who was willing to learn them, even when they hurt. Then she left, walking down the sidewalk with her shoulders straight and her head high, and Ethan watched her go with the understanding that letting someone go is sometimes the only kind of love that matters. He stood there long after she disappeared from view, the city lights beginning to shimmer around him, and made himself a promise. Not to win her back, not to prove himself worthy of redemption, but simply to be better, to lead differently. To create spaces where people like Maya didn't have to fight so hard just to be seen. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't satisfying, it didn't come with the kind of closure that makes a good story. But it was real. And real, he was finally learning, was all that mattered. The night deepened around him, cool and vast, and for the first time in weeks, Ethan felt something close to peace. Not because he'd been forgiven, but because he'd finally stopped asking for forgiveness and started doing the work of actually changing. Maya had given him a gift in leaving. She'd given him the truth. And the truth, uncomfortable and uncompromising as it was, had set something loose inside him that power never could. He turned and walked back into the building, into the company he'd built, with new eyes and a different kind of determination. The work ahead would be long, difficult, uncertain. But he would do it anyway, not for her, not even for himself, but for everyone who came after, for every person who deserved to be seen, to be heard, to matter. It was the least he could do. And maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. There's something we don't talk about enough when we talk about love. We focus on the butterflies, the chemistry, the moments when two people find each other across crowded rooms and everything else falls away. We celebrate the happy endings, the reconciliations, the love that conquers all. But what about the love that doesn't get to conquer anything? What about the love that arrives too late, built on a foundation too broken to hold weight? What about the love that's real and deep and true, but still isn't enough to bridge the distance created by harm? That's the kind of love this story is really about. Ethan loved Maya. There's no question about that. By the end, he saw her clearly, valued her deeply, would have given anything to undo the hurt he'd caused. But love, no matter how genuine, doesn't erase history. It doesn't undo systems. It doesn't magically repair the dignity that was chipped away day after day, meeting after meeting. in 1,000 small moments of being made to feel less than. Maya made a choice that might be hard to understand if you've never been in her position. She chose herself. She chose her dignity over the possibility of love. She chose to walk away from someone who finally saw her, because being seen shouldn't require first being invisible. Being valued shouldn't require first being diminished. And love, real love, shouldn't ask you to forget what it felt like to be treated as if you didn't matter. Some people might call that unforgiving. They might say she should have given him a chance, that people deserve second chances, that he was trying to change, and maybe they're right in some abstract way. But here's what those people often miss. Forgiveness isn't owed. Reconciliation isn't mandatory. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is recognize that certain bridges once burned weren't meant to be rebuilt. Not because of cruelty, but because of self-preservation. Because you finally learned that your worth isn't negotiable even for love, especially for love. Ethan's story doesn't end with getting the girl. It ends with him becoming a better leader, creating better systems, using his power differently. Not because it would win Maya back, but because it was the right thing to do. That's not the ending we're trained to want. We want the grand gesture, the speech that changes everything, the moment where love makes everything okay. But life isn't a movie, and some lessons only stick when they cost us something we desperately wanted. Maya's story ends with her walking into a new opportunity, a fresh start, a place where she doesn't have to fight so hard just to be heard. She carries the scars of what happened, but she also carries something else, the knowledge that she chose herself when it mattered most, that she didn't let love become another reason to accept less than she deserved, and maybe that's its own kind of happy ending. Not perfect, not pain-free, but real, dignified. Hers. So what's the lesson here? What are we supposed to take from a love story that doesn't end in love? Maybe it's this: the people we overlook have entire worlds inside them, the quiet ones, the ones who don't fight for attention, the ones who've learned that survival sometimes means making yourself small. They're not less than. They're not waiting to be discovered by someone with power and vision. They're complete, valuable, worthy, right now, whether anyone notices or not. Maybe the lesson is that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to see the impact of your choices, even when that impact is painful. It's about understanding that intention doesn't matter nearly as much as outcome. That building something successful means nothing if you build it on the backs of people you never bothered to see. Or maybe the lesson is simpler, more personal. Maybe it's about asking yourself, who am I not seeing? Whose voice am I talking over? Whose brilliance am I dismissing because it doesn't come packaged the way I expect? What systems am I participating in right now that make people feel invisible? These aren't comfortable questions, but comfortable questions rarely change anything. Love is beautiful. Love is powerful. But love without respect is hollow. Love without equity is dangerous. And love that asks someone to forget their own dignity isn't really love at all. It's just another form of control dressed in softer clothes. Ethan learned that. Maya knew it all along. And maybe, if we're honest, we all need to learn it too. Because the world is full of invisible people. People working jobs where they're undervalued. People in relationships where they're taken for granted. People moving through spaces where their presence is tolerated but never celebrated. And every single one of them deserves to be seen. Not for what they can do for us, not for how they make us feel, but for who they are in all their complicated, brilliant, imperfect humanity. This story doesn't tie up neatly. It doesn't give you the satisfaction of a perfect ending. But life rarely does. What it gives you instead is truth. The truth that some damage can't be undone, that some relationships can't be salvaged, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone go. And the truth that change, real change, doesn't happen because of love. It happens because someone finally decided to do the work, regardless of whether it leads to redemption. So here's my question for you, the one I want you to sit with after this story ends. What would you do? If you were Ethan, would you have had the courage to see your own complicity? If you were Maya, would you have found the strength to walk away? And in your own life right now, are you more like the person with power who isn't paying attention, or the person without it who's learned to stay quiet? Neither answer is comfortable, but both are worth examining. Because we're all participants in systems. We all have the power to see or overlook, to include or dismiss, to make space or take it. And every day we make choices about which kind of person we're going to be. This story was about two people, but it's really about all of us, about the ways we hurt each other without meaning to, about the ways we love imperfectly, about the ways we grow or don't when faced with the consequences of who we've been. It's about hope. Not the easy kind, but the kind that's earned through hard work and honest reckoning. The kind that doesn't guarantee happy endings, but makes better futures possible. If this story touched something in you, if it made you think, made you feel, made you question anything about how you move through the world, then do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Not just because it helps the algorithm, though it does, but because it tells me that stories like this matter to you. That you want more narratives that don't shy away from complexity, that honor the messy reality of being human, that understand love isn't always enough, and that's okay. Your like is a signal. It says, keep telling these stories, keep holding up mirrors, keep asking uncomfortable questions, and I promise you, I will. If you're not already subscribed to Cottrell Plus Love, subscribe now and turn on those notifications, because this channel isn't like other storytelling channels. We don't just give you entertainment, though our stories will absolutely keep you engaged. We give you emotional experiences. We give you reflections on love, power, dignity, choice, and what it means to be truly seen. Every story here is crafted to make you feel something real, something that stays with you long after the video ends, something that might even change how you see yourself and the people around you. Stories aren't just escapes. They're blueprints for understanding. They're practice runs for empathy. They're safe spaces to explore hard truths without having to live through them first, and in a world that often feels shallow, transactional, disconnected, that matters more than ever. Here's what else is waiting for you on this channel. Stories about second chances that don't come with guarantees. Stories about people who loved deeply but couldn't stay. Stories about mistakes that taught more than success ever could. Stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary choices. Stories about hope, not the naive kind, but the kind that's forged in fire and still manages to glow. Every single story is designed to do what this one just did: make you pause, make you think, make you feel like you're not alone in whatever complicated thing you're going through. Because you're not. We're all navigating love, loss, power, dignity, choice. We're all trying to figure out how to be good people in systems that don't always reward goodness. We're all carrying invisible wounds and hoping someone will finally see us clearly. These stories, they're for all of us. Go ahead, look through the channel right now. You'll find stories that might mirror your own life in ways that surprise you. Stories about love that arrived at the wrong time. About forgiveness that was asked for but couldn't be given. About people who chose themselves when the world told them to choose differently. About leaders who had to learn that power without compassion is just another form of violence. About quiet people whose strength was mistaken for weakness until someone finally paid attention. Each one is a journey, each one matters, and each one is waiting for you. Don't let the algorithm decide whether you see them. Take control. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Make sure you're here for every new story we release. Because I can promise you this, we're just getting started. The stories coming next are even more powerful, even more necessary, even more designed to make you feel alive. One more thing before you go. Share this video. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's someone who's been made to feel invisible and needs the reminder that their worth isn't determined by who notices them. Maybe it's someone in a position of power who needs to understand the impact they're having. Maybe it's someone navigating a complicated love and trying to figure out whether staying or leaving is the braver choice. This story will mean something different to each person who hears it, but it will mean something. And in a world full of noise, stories that actually mean something are rare and precious. Be the person who shares them. Be the person who says, this mattered to me and it might matter to you too. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for letting this story into your heart, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it didn't give you the ending you might have wanted. That's trust, and I don't take it lightly. Every view, every like, every comment, every share, it all tells me that what we're building here at Cottrell Plus Love is working. That you want stories with soul, stories with truth, stories that feel like love, even when they're about love that couldn't survive. Keep coming back. Keep feeling with us. Keep letting these stories remind you that you're human, beautifully and messily human, and that's enough. More than enough. Until the next story, take care of yourself. Be kind to the invisible people in your life. And remember, being seen starts with seeing others, really seeing them, not for what they can do for you, but for who they are. That's where everything changes. That's where love, real love, actually begins. See you in the next story. Cottrell Plus Love, stories that feel like love.